Okay, so this is my presentation for my Anthropology of the Post-Soviet States class. The person I interviewed, her name is Dina, and she was interviewed by me, Levi Howard. So let's get right into it. So a little bit of background on Dina. Her father's Bulgarian and her mother's Ukrainian, and she's part of a fairly large family with four sisters and two brothers. And on top of that, she's part of a religious family, so her family was Christian. She lived in the Soviet Union for 22 years, so from 1976 to 1998. And her relation to me was she was my babysitter from when I was 2 months old until preschool. And she's actually the person who taught me how to speak Russian. So Dina grew up in Moldova. Okay, so you can see it's just sandwiched there in between Romania and Ukraine. And specifically, she grew up in the town of Bender, which is spelled Bender. You can see it's in the southeastern part of Moldova there. Um, and Bandera, during the time of the Soviet Union, was a pretty, well, fairly prosperous city. There's a lot of factory jobs there, and a lot of Soviets or I guess, yeah, immigrated to Moldova in search of work. So there's kind of two focuses to this interview, and so the first one was national identity. So Zina grew up in a fairly unique scenario. So she was born and raised in Moldova in a Bulgarian family. So her family practiced more Bulgarian traditions and ate Bulgarian food. Um, and she spoke Russian, so she didn't speak Moldovan or Bulgarian. So she kind of um, didn't fit into the Moldovan culture because of the language barrier, and she wasn't fully Bulgarian culture because everybody around her wasn't Bulgarian. And she lived in a very diverse community, and they were all Russian speakers. So this community was made up of Ukrainians, Bulgarians, Moldovans, Belarusians, Romanians, and Russians. So when I asked her what her identity is, the first thing she said is she's Moldovan. And so I asked her, "So you're Moldovan?" She said, "No, I was born in Moldova, but I'm not Moldovan. I'm Bulgarian." So I said, um, "So you're Bulgarian?" She said, "Well, my family's Bulgarian, but I can't speak Bulgarian." And on top of that, her parents weren't born in Bulgaria. They were born in Moldova, in Ukraine. Her father was born in Moldova, and her mother's born in Ukraine. So what we kind of boiled it down to was this statement at the bottom. I'm from Moldova, but I'm not Moldovan. I'm Bulgarian, but my parents were not born in Bulgaria. I speak Russian, but I'm not Russian. So her national identity is kind of tricky due to uh, the community she grew up in. Okay, it's kind of a mix. It's not her family didn't really fit in. The language barrier with Moldovans, she couldn't really adapt all aspects of Moldovan culture. And the other thing she realized was her national identity depends on who is asking her. So if a Russian person was to ask her, she would probably give this description here, um, because she was telling me an example of when she was in Russia. People would ask her, "Where are you from?" She'd say, "Oh, I'm from Moldova." They'd start speaking to her in Moldovan. She's like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Like, I don't speak Moldovan. I'm not Moldovan. I speak Russian." Um, so in terms of national identity, hers is probably fairly unique, and it's a little bit tricky. Um, and I will go into that a little bit more in the second focus of this interview, which was Soviet identity. But first, I want to give a little bit of background on kind of a key event that she lived through. Oh, and before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more about the Moldovan disconnect. So, like I said, she speaks Russian. She doesn't speak Moldovan or Bulgarian, and so the language barrier kind of created a cultural disconnect for her. So I mean, it's hard to adapt all aspects of culture if you can't really speak the language. And she said for her, that was definitely a big factor. In addition, she was surrounded by mostly non Moldovans. She was in a diverse community. There were Moldovans there, but Moldovans were by far not the majority. Um, there was a lot of different cultures mixing. And so she did not have like a full Moldovan identity, Moldovan national identity. In addition, she lived in city. Benderek is a pretty urban environment, and she said that Moldovans occupied more of the rural areas, and these urban areas where factories were located, where people came for jobs, were a lot more diverse. So in general, she was not surrounded by Moldovan culture as much. Um, and in addition, she talked a little bit about there was some discrimination towards Moldovans by Russian speakers. So Russian was seen as a um, uh, more superior language, especially during Soviet times. Um, so Moldovans were kind of looked down on and discriminated based on their language, especially if if Russian speakers heard Moldovans speaking Moldovan, they were definitely quickly identified as Moldovan and I guess kind of seen as inferior, kind of unmodern. They're more in the countryside, more in the rural areas, not so much part of the cities and the factory lifestyle, factory worker lifestyle. And for that reason, because of this discrimination, Moldovans kind of kept to themselves. They weren't um, part of the culture that she grew up in as much. So the event that I touched on briefly there was during the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a civil war that broke out. I'm going to give just a very quick history lesson here. It's definitely a lot more complicated than how I'm about to describe it, but here goes. So there was a civil war that broke out from March 2nd, 1992 to July 1992, so fairly short, few months. Um, but from Dina's account of it, it was quite intense. So you can see on this graphic on the right, the kind of orange highlighted area that is Moldova. That was kind of a more Russian-speaking community, and the green is the rest of Moldova. You can see, interestingly, in the key, um, you can see the green is labeled as Free Moldova, and the orange is labeled as Moldova under Russian military occupation. So just based on the key, if I had to guess, I would say that this graphic was probably made by a Moldovan just based on their description of the different regions. So pretty much what this civil war was about was after the fall of the Soviet Union, Moldova wanted to join with Romania and cut all former Soviet ties and Russian ties, including language. So the way Dina described it was schools immediately switched to Moldovan. Um, a lot of like documents, newspapers, advertisements all switched to Moldovan almost immediately. And so what you had was this Russian speaking community in Moldova that doesn't speak Moldovan, um, living in a situation where everything around them is changing to a language they don't know, to a culture they don't know. And so they're like, whoa, 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 hold up. You know, we're Moldovans, we're born here, we've lived here, but we don't speak Moldovan. We speak Russian. So why are you changing everything? And so this Russian speaking community, this group, was where they were labeled as separatists because they did not want to join up with Romania. And so this region is called Pridnestrovia, and that's the orange region that's labeled here. So pretty much what happened was Moldovan forces occupied Pridnestrovia, and then shortly after, Russian forces came in to similarly, like now in Ukraine, to support Russian-speaking individuals. So the Russian 14th Army was the army that came in to aid Pridnestrovia, and Benderech was one of the cities that was on the front line. So quickly, let me go back. Oops, let me go back. You can see Benderech is right on the edge of the green, and where the green and the orange converge. So it's one of the cities that were on the front line of the conflict. And this is the city where Dina grew up and lived through the Civil War. So Dina was actually evacuated to Ukraine by her father for a short time. They were fortunate enough to have a vehicle, and so they were able to fit all the children. Um, Her father fit all the children into the car and drove them to Ukraine, dropped them off, and then came back and lived through the war in the city with Dina's mother. So her mother and her father stayed in Bendera for the war. So eventually, Russian forces did push back Moldovan forces, and that was kind of signified at the end of the war. Um, and Russia actually stayed for quite a while, and they're still to this day have a big influence on this region of Moldova. And kind of the war was bad, but even worse were the effects of the war after. So keep in mind the or remember that Gina's community was diverse. It had Moldovans and it had a lot of other Russian-speaking nationalities there. But after the war, there was a lot of tension between Moldovans and Russian speakers. So there were, um, Moldovan and Russian-speaking neighbors turning each other in. There was all kinds of conflicts going on, brawls in the streets, as Dina described. So there are a lot of long-lasting effects of this war, and this kind of ties into the next main focus of the interview I had with Dina, which was her Soviet identity. So, um, as I've said, she grew up in a Russian-speaking community, inherently Soviet for that reason, and again, her Russian-speaking community was saved by Russia, by the the nation that was um, most closely aligned with the Soviet ideology and system. So in that way, her identity was strongly tied to being Soviet. Now, on the other side of that, her family was religious, and so for that reason, she was definitely her family was separated from traditional Soviet culture. Um, the way she described it was there was no life for religious people in the Soviet system. So um, if you did not align yourself with the Communist Party, there was no way to get promoted in your work. There's no way to get you were on the waiting list for apartments forever. Um, there's just no life for you there. Um, and there was no, free practice of religion. So there was oppression and there was religious persecution. So um, for her, similarly to her national identity, her Soviet identity, she described it as it's complicated. So kind of looking into these um, into our focuses, it's easy to see how the transition from Soviet to post-Soviet and the unique communities that people grow up in can have interesting influences on how people see their own identities. So, in Dina's case, her strong community ties to a Soviet identity, to a Russian speaking identity, um, and the religious side of her life were conflicting. And so, in that way, her Soviet identity is complicated. And similarly, her national identity is also very complicated. She grew up in a mixing pot of nationalities. And um, she kind of in many ways she didn't fully live out like one national identity, so she wasn't totally Moldovan, wasn't totally Bulgarian. She was a mix of a lot of things. And you can see that in the way that she describes her national identity. She doesn't quite know how to describe it because it is so complicated and so mixed. So, kind of what I've taken away from this interview is that when you're looking at the post-Soviet states and how people see their national and Soviet identities, there's a lot of circumstances, situations, the way people grow up that can change and influence how people view themselves. And I think, for example, events such as the Civil War that Dina lived through, we learned about Chernobyl in Ukraine and how that shaped people's national and Soviet identities. So it's interesting to see how events that people live through um, can shape their identity. Um, so with that, that is kind of my main takeaways from this interview. Um, I think I was fortunate to have somebody that I was very close with to be able to interview because the interview was more of a conversation, and she was very open with sharing things with me. There's a lot of things she shared with me that I did not include in the slides or that I'm not going to talk about because it's more personal. But um, definitely there is a lot of conflict in Dina's national and Soviet identities. And so that's kind of the main takeaways. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. Try to keep it. I tried to keep it pretty brief, pretty um, keep it going, so you guys don't have to listen through. But thank you.